Hi, everyone. It seems hard to believe now, but the great financial crisis of 2008 and aftermath is now in the distant past. I think, in fact, in November, there will be some voters who weren't born yet. But for some of us, it was a huge defining event, and financial markets as a source of economic problems, instability, just everything hasn't gone away. And I thought I would talk with Dennis Kelleher, who is the head of Better Markets, an independent think tank devoted to trying to make financial markets work better for the rest of us. And in the note, I'll mention I do have a personal connection to Better Markets, but that's not why I'm interviewing Mr. Kelleher. Dennis is former Senate aide, which congressional staffers are one of the great sources of expertise in America. And I want to talk about financial markets. So, hi,
Hi, thanks for having me, Paul. Good to see you.
good to see you. So, you know, uh, I have a bunch of questions, but we can go wherever this goes. The first thing I do get this sometimes whenever I try to talk about financial market functioning, which is that most financial assets are owned by a relatively small part of the population, even if you take 401ks into account. So why isn't this just a fight among the investor class? Why should everyone care about this?
Well, it's a great question because there's so much lack of information about financial markets, financial system, and frankly, as you well know, the economy. One of the great services that you're provided and many of your colleagues is basically translating what's happening in the economy and financial markets to the average Main Street American, reader of the New York Times, consumer of news. And the truth is that the financial markets and obviously the economy impact everybody. And you're right. This November, during the election, some of the people voting will not have actually have any awareness of the 2008 financial crash, which was the biggest crash in the United States since 1929, which caused the Great Depression. And even though they may not have been born at that time, the people who are voting in November are still living through the repercussions of the 2008 crash. We basically lost an entire generation of Americans, economically speaking, from that crash. It took 10 years for the U6, the broad unemployment rate, to return to pre-crash levels. It was 2017 before that happened. And indeed, the Fed did an interesting study, which people can quibble with the baseline and things, but they did a study in 2018 that showed at the end of 2016, 90% of Americans were poorer than they were in 2007 by 17 to 35%. So if you think about that, at the end of 2016, the best off American in that 90% bucket was 17% poorer. Now, you could say the baseline of 2007 was inflated, but by and large, 90% of Americans have been doing pretty poorly since the crash for a lot of reasons. And so today, or November, when those people go to vote, they are actually living through the continuing economic consequences, financial consequences, and actually political consequences, because the rise of Trump and the dissatisfaction of voters, Americans, and actually voters in the UK and elsewhere. Martin Wolf from the Financial Times wrote a terrific
Yes.
book called "The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism" that showed how if countries don't deliver for the broad population, then democracy erodes and people look for easy answers, authoritarians and strongmen, and we end up with Brexit, we end up with Trump. And so you're right, people don't remember the crash, but the crash is incredibly important to everybody in America. And the circumstances that we find ourselves in today are unfortunately echoing many of the drivers of that crash. Now, I didn't answer your question about the investor class. But when you get to investors, you're right. When you look at investors, something like 87% of the value of the stock market is the value is owned by the top 10%. On the other hand, there are today $27 trillion worth of assets in 401ks and IRAs retirement
Yep.
accounts, overwhelmingly skewed to the top. But not only, and importantly, one of the great projects that America really needs to undertake is to democratize finance so that financial assets and the ability to grow wealth is more broadly spread out. One of the big crippling problems we have today is The bottom 50% of Americans, about 165 million Americans,
Right.
only have 2.5% of the wealth of the country. It's astonishing, right? And so, a big part of what Better Markets does in economic and financial policy making is try and rebalance what we have as a rigged economy that's driven by a rigged and broken financial system. So, our economy is producing very well for the top 10%, and our financial system is structured to deliver those results. Now, part of that is wealth extraction, but a lot of it is just structural drivers put in place by policymakers in Washington that cater to the top 10%. And that unfortunately, Paul, as you know, is on a bipartisan basis.
No.
Um, you know, go ahead.
We'll get into that a bit, but just let me just ask a question. That's it. I'm going to actually kind of veer off course, although this is something I wanted to get to. Top 10%. So basically, uh, ownership of stock is roughly speaking a top 10% activity. When you talk about skewed, I mean, I have a sense that it is actually increasingly skewed towards a fraction of a fraction. Do you have anything I should take away about how the system is rigged or skewed within the stock owning population?
Well, I think the problem is that the higher up you go on the wealth scale, as you know better than I'll never know, the greater your ability to accumulate even more wealth in a tax-free fashion, right?
Yeah,
And then to pass it along to both use it today as if it was cash and income, not be taxed on it, use it, and then hand it off through inheritance without being touched to heirs for multi-generational wealth concentration at the top. Bad for the economy and bad for democracy. Um, a lot of people have a lot of ideas. I mean, you've talked to Ro Kahana, and there's all sorts of people with different ideas about what to do in terms of we've got a wealth tax on the ballot in California. But in terms of the structural drivers, one of the problems that we see at Better Markets is that people don't actually, and when I say people, I mean Democrats, don't pay enough attention to the financial structural drivers of the economy. So here's just a simple example that people are often surprised by. Community banks in the United States, there's about a little over 4,000 of them. You see them on every corner, street across America, particularly in real America, as opposed to where you and I live, Paul, which is by
right,
no means real America. Um, but those banks lend out 75 cents on average of every dollar of deposit. The big Wall Street banks, they lend out somewhere less than 50 cents of every dollar of deposit. And that's because it's so much more profitable for them catering to the rich, mostly engaging in financial activities, trading, capital markets activities. And so ask yourself, why is that? Well, that's because the rules enacted by the banking regulators and Congress and other regulators allow the profit margins on the financialized trading side to be so much greater than on the lending side. I mean, truthfully, the rules that are created in Washington actually discriminate against lending to the real economy. And so you have community banks which don't have capital markets activities. They're bread and butter banks for the most part. Depends on how you define community banks. Some people define them all the way up to Wall Street, but those are people in the propaganda industry. But these are people who are actually driving the real economy. So, for example, the community banks have somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% of the total assets of the banking system, but they actually provide somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of all loans to small businesses.
right.
Well, why are we not having rules that skew towards benefiting the real productive economy and away from the trading financialized activities which serve the very top 1, 2%, and not the rest? And actually, not only doesn't it not serve the rest of the country, it's at the expense of the rest of the country. Last year, we put out Better Markets put out a report showing earlier this year that last year the growth in major Wall Street bank lending to what are called non-banks grew by 50%. Do you know what their lending to the real economy grew by? Zero. Zero. And so a lot of these activities are being pushed out into what are called non-banks because it's more profitable. It's more profitable because the rules make it more profitable. The rules are created in Washington by policymakers, regulators, and legislators who unfortunately too often are beholden to the wrong people. And so you end up with this cycle of where the rules keep reinforcing the current structure that's channeling activity and money to the top and away from Main Street.
So as I understood it, I was reading some of Better Markets reports. There's actually, if you're a big financial institution, lending to non-banks, which then probably ends up being a roundabout route by which the money reaches lenders, but not through the bank, the original bank. Um, Actually, it's kind of got a regulatory advantage because it's lower capital requirements. If I got that right?
Well, it's lower capital requirements. It's lower requirements across the board. Capital is one of the core drivers, but it's not the only one.
So if you put money, you put your money with Citigroup, or they're always available. Anyway, if you put your money with one of the big financial institutions, a lot of it is just going to be routed through. Uh, it's not going to be lent out, or much of it will not be lent out to business, small business, households. It'll be lent to other. It'll kind of divert around, and it'll in effect be channeled into a more well, what you consider a worse way through which the money reaches the rest of the economy. Is that am I being is that a fair summary?
That that's a fair summary of part of it. Keep in mind, a lot of this money is funding hedge funds. They're
Right.
doing big basis trades, basically swinging for the fences. I'm not saying there's no value at any hedge fund to the real economy, but when you look at their activities, that's not exactly what I would call beneficial lending to the real economy, the productive economy. Private equity, which is basically a strip and rip business model. It gets their money from the banks. Almost everything goes back to the banks, and that's because deposit money is the safest, soundest, and cheapest source of funding for economic activities. And so the banks have got the money, and what they have to decide where are they going to send? They're going to send it over here to lend to Main Street businesses where their profit margin is here, or they go over here to hedge funds, private equity, or other financialized activities, business development corporations, crypto, all sorts of things where the profit margin is here. They're making rational economic decisions
Right.
in their self interest to profit maximize. The question is, why are the people in Washington structuring it that way so that their profit margins are like that? The current capital rules that we're fighting about, Paul, are supposed to change that. And in fact, what they're supposed to do is have, for example, the trading activities accurately reflect the risk associated with them. And if they accurately did that, the capital requirements for those activities would be much higher. Not only are the banking agencies with the Federal Reserve in the lead not doing that, they're actually, and we put out a study on this, people can see it at Better Markets website, when they're done with the proposed capital rules, capital at the biggest, most dangerous banks in the United States are going to be back to the levels roughly before what they were at before the 2008 crash. I mean, think about that. It's
Yeah.
crazy, right? Here's something that's even crazier. A bunch of those big banks are going to have capital rules, capital levels that are roughly similar to community banks. Now,
So you mean so which are low, right? Community banks because they're in a very
yes,
safe
well,
business.
right. But the community bank, the risk to the economy, the systemic risk to the economy of community banks, first of all, as an absolute matter, is pretty low. But relative to the giants on Wall Street, they're infinitesimal. They're not even comparable. And we've got a Federal Reserve, particularly the vice chairman of supervision and regulation over there, that acts as if she's the primary lobbyist for Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan Chase. She even hired, Paul, she hired three of Wall Street's top lobbyist lawyers to be her senior advisors. I'm not making this up, one was a vice president at Goldman Sachs. One was one of Wall Street's top lawyers at one of the top Wall Street law firms for 35 years. And the other one was a top executive at Wall Street's biggest trade group in Washington. Those are her three top advisors, one of
Can
whom
I
she
just
put.
ask, uh, what does it mean to be a top advisor at the Fed? Are they Fed employees or are they just kind of like outside? I actually should know this, but I don't.
No, they're Fed employees. They're on staff.
Okay.
She actually made this lawyer. We put out a press release about him and her hiring of the three of them. Um, I mean, this is not just the fox guarding the hen house. This is the fox in charge of all operations of the hen house. Um, so the lawyer who was on Wall Street for 35 years, serving his clients for 35 years, all of the banks, is now the director of regulation and supervision of his former clients at the Federal Reserve.
Right.
And the right hand top staffer for the vice chairman of supervision and regulation on the board of governors of the Federal Reserve. And so anybody who is surprised that the Fed is now enacting or proposing and going to enact rules incredibly favorable to the biggest banks on Wall Street, and it's not just capital, Paul. I mean, one of the trade-off here is that banks get to have this somewhat unique role in the United States, right? They get to accumulate all these activities and take people's deposits. You know, Main Street American deposits is how these banks fund themselves largely. And that's why we insure that money through the FDIC so people have confidence that they'll get their money back. But the exchanges, we regulate them so that they don't actually threaten the economy and financial system of the United States because they're so big. So that means they're supervised. So every day, people don't know this, but every day, people who work for the Federal Reserve and are paid for by the American people go to work at the biggest banks supervising them. They literally, that's their office. They go in, they look at the books and records, they talk to people all day long at Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup. That's called supervision. It's not seen, it's basically invisible, but incredibly important. Regulation people see. But so the Fed is not only cutting back on capital and regulation like stress tests and other important safety features, they're also gutting supervision. And so they're basically unleashing the biggest banks in the United States from modest, sensible regulation and supervision that's supposed to protect Main Street jobs, homes, and savings from high risk, reckless, and inappropriate conduct by these gigantic banks, which we saw in 2008 what happens when you don't regulate them or supervise them. And we actually just saw it again, Paul, in 2023.
Right. Well, this is 2023 with the Silicon Valley Bank and all of that, right? Or is that
2023, there were four big bank failures. Three of the four biggest bank failures in the history of the United States happened in 2023. People don't realize it.
even I didn't realize that. So I'm supposed to be on top of these things. But yeah, and so just well, I mean, this is happening incredibly fast, right? Normally, we think kind of it's supposed to be that you forget the lessons of the last financial crisis basically once people age out of the business and it's nobody is around who really remembers it. But we were dealing with the aftermath of 2008, just 15, 16 years ago. And you're saying that basically we're fully back to that kind of Wild West, no supervision world, or maybe worse.
Well, we're getting there, and the direction is there. We're not quite there yet, but the thrust of what's happening now is broader, deeper, and more reckless than it was in the years leading up to the 2008 crash. I mean, if you think about it, it's quite amazing. The so-called shadow banking system, right?
Right, that's it. Yeah.
Non-bank financial institutions today is bigger than it was in '08 and less regulated. And it was identified as one of the primary drivers of the '08 crash. And as you
That's
know,
right. I mean, just to say, I mean, I remember very vividly in like the fall of 2008. The conventional wisdom, even the textbooks, including my own textbook, said, well, we can't have a 1931 style banking crisis because the banks are insured and regulated. And then was sort of the week of Lehman's failure was, 60% of the banking system is shadow banks. And you're saying that we're back to that and more now.
yeah, I don't remember the exact percentage,
Yes.
but yes. And what's worse is they're less regulated today than they were then in many material respects. And now a lot of people think, well, it's hard to worry about big catastrophic events when, there's a lot going on every day. But this is happening fast. And because there's so much happening, in the Trump chaos machine, where there's not a scandal a day, it's like almost an hour. J.D. Vance, who I almost never agree with on anything, said in a speech recently at the Nixon library that if the Nixon crimes happened today, it wouldn't even last the full news cycle.
Yeah.
And he's probably right. And so a lot of this is it's not only happening fast, it's happening invisible because just a very small slice of what's happening is getting into the media. Meanwhile, the termites, the industry termites, are working day and night in the policymaking process in Washington, eating away at the foundations of the financial stability of the United States.
Let's just say you're talking a lot about the Federal Reserve, which that's kind of alarming because the Fed has traditionally been the kind of more competent, less politicized piece, and you're basically saying that now that piece of the Fed is effectively part of the has been captured. Is that a fair description?
The Fed has unfortunately been largely captured. It's being run by people who have an agenda that is not consistent with the best interest of the American people, frankly. I'm not talking about the monetary policy side, that's a
Right.
whole different discussion. But on the supervision and regulation side, they are not acting consistent with the best interest of Main Street Americans. Wall Street is winning day in and day out in the policy fights. There's going to be news coming out, I think, over the next several weeks, maybe months, that will illustrate that pretty starkly. It's really quite astonishing what has happened at the Fed. And that isn't to say, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of good, hardworking, dedicated public servants at the Fed who nobody will ever see or acknowledge, who have been working for many years and continue to work hard, fighting a good fight. But the leadership at the Federal Reserve at this point, the Trump leadership, is doing to the Federal Reserve what's being done everywhere. Now, we know we had two big Supreme Court cases recently which supposedly cabined off the Federal Reserve from direct political control by the president, unlike the other agencies. And that's true, but it's all relative, right? I mean, the president has direct political control of the SEC, CFTC, everything from the NLRB, the FTC, the FCC, all the critically important regulatory agencies that have been in place since the New Deal, um, basically, creating an economy and enabling an economy to be profit maximizing, but still have adequate protections for the public. I mean, and that's the balance that we need to get. And actually, a former colleague of yours, David Leonhardt, wrote a great book. And I always have it on my desk and I recommend it to people. Great book, terrible title. It's called Ours Was the Shining Future. And
Yeah.
it's a great book, great history of how the United States post Great Depression built the largest middle class in the history of the world and really compressed gross income inequality and created wealth creation in places people didn't think it would happen. And he talks about how things changed when Reagan came in and kind of where we are now. Um, but that was because we had a regulatory state. Now, people can argue about what's reasonable, how much is too much, how much is too little. But we struck a balance that enabled the SEC, the CFTC, the Federal Reserve, and other regulatory agencies from labor to health to product safety that balanced and frankly took some of the craziness off the blind profit maximization built with the engine built within the economy. Now, that basically the Supreme Court said last week that doesn't exist anymore. What exists going forward is the president gets to control all those agencies, and all those agencies are now subject to but not only the political agenda, but the whim of whoever the president is.
So let me just, for listeners who may not, SEC is Securities and Exchange Commission, which is supposed to regulate stocks and corporate accounting and all of that. CFTC is Commodities.
Futures Trading Commission,
Which is
regulating derivatives and commodities. It's the least known but very important agency. So, for example, commodities, what bread in your lunch pail, right? Cereal in your breakfast bowl, gas in your car, heat in your home, all of that, all those markets are regulated by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission.
yeah, and all of these now are. I mean, actually, Humphrey's executor, the case that where the Supreme Court essentially said that Congress cannot establish a mandate and then expect an agency to fulfill it if the president doesn't want to, and that really affects all of these agencies, right?
Right. Actually, the case last week was Slaughter v. FTC, and
Right.
that case overruled Humphrey's executor, which was a Supreme Court case from, I want to say 90 years ago. I don't remember
Yeah.
exactly. Could be 80. Contrary to the view of my kids, I actually wasn't around then.
It's
So I
90
didn't
years
read.
ago because it was actually a ruling against FDR. It
Yes.
was
Oh, yeah.
FDR was the New Deal was trying to change something, and the Supreme Court said, well, that's not what Congress said, and you, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, cannot change it. But now it's been waived for Donald Trump. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. No. Well, look, we have a right-wing Supreme Court, a supermajority on the Supreme Court that is essentially creating, for the first time in American history, an all-powerful executive branch. I mean, as you know, it's been referred to by legal scholars as the unitary executive theory, where
Right.
essentially the president, whoever the president is, gets to control the entire executive branch. And of course, over the last 90 years or so since the New Deal, we've had an administrative state that has, in key respects, put some brakes on the worst excesses of unrestrained profit seeking. And
Yeah.
basically, they're just basic public protections. I think of it as it's like cars, right? I mean, cars today are very safe, right? They have airbags, they have bumpers that are shock absorbers, we have glass that shatters and doesn't kill you, we have reinforced doors. What the Supreme Court is doing with Slaughter v. FTC and these other cases that's empowering the president is literally they're taking the airbags out of your car. They're taking the bumpers off your car. Except the car in this case is the country. It's our democracy, our economy, and our financial system. And the safety aspects of that system that protect our democracy, protect our economy and financial system, protect people's jobs and savings, and frankly, their safety, even things like the Consumer Product Safety Commission or the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. I mean, all of these things are that are people these acronyms that can get confusing, but what they really are safety mechanisms and protections for Main Street Americans from things that happen in a gigantic economy like the United States that would otherwise have really bad impacts on Main Street Americans, whether it's their job, their health, their safety, their savings, frankly, their families and their dreams. And that's what these agencies, some do it better than others. And I'm not saying they always get it right. They don't, they get it wrong. We criticize them all the time. We criticize them when Democrats are in charge, and we criticize them when Republicans are in charge. We also praise them when they do it. But we need them. We need these shock absorbers on an otherwise unrestrained economy that's just profit driven. And that's what we're seeing now.
I just want to break in. We ended up talking a lot about the Fed, which is critical supervisory role, but the uh, Better Markets have been writing a lot about the SEC lately, and there's stuff happening there that's barely. I mean, I think even I barely am seeing anything about it in the newspapers, and yet that's just really important, right? There's a lot going on at the Securities and Exchange Commission. You want to just tell me about that for a sec?
So, the Securities and Exchange Commission was created in 1933. There were two laws, 1933 and 1934. And by the way, I should say, if anybody's really interested in this, I hate to be like a book review, but there's
Right.
some great stuff. Diane Henriques wrote a terrific book last year called Taming the Street, which is kind of a history of the SEC, how it came about, why it's so important, what happened during the Great Depression. But it's also kind of a history of American economy. It's kind of like David Leonhardt's book a little bit,
Right.
and it's an easy read. But the SEC regulates investor protection in our markets. And you asked this earlier, Paul. Why should anybody really care, given that so many of these assets are owned by the top 10%? I mean, look, one of the great things about the American economy is that it has been pretty dynamic and innovative, and people all over the country come up with ideas, some of which fail, some of which succeed. Those that succeed need capital to grow so
Right.
that they can take it from their garage to a local store, to a bigger store, to a factory, to global markets. And when they start, they end up using basically angel capital of friends and family. Ultimately, if they get a good idea, venture capitalists. And then at the end of that, what used to be the big success would be your company would go public on the stock exchange. And that's how companies generated enormous amounts of capital, which is just a fancy word for money. They got enough money to grow their business, build things, hire a lot more people. It's how we built the middle class. And that's what the SEC regulates is the public part of that capital pipeline, the big public markets, the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, and other exchanges. And they regulate both the disclosure obligations and they police those markets. And they do that because what happened in the 1920s that contributed mightily to the 1929 crash and the Great Depression was basically people were lying, cheating, and stealing with almost no regulation at all. The big banks were often multi hydra headed financial conglomerates doing self dealing, conflicts of interest. Not only didn't they disclose things, when they did, they often lied and defrauded people. And a lot of that ended up being basically what we would think of today as kind of Ponzi schemes, nothing really there, right? Except the
Right.
people running the firms enriching themselves. The SEC was created to make sure we had actually well regulated and well policed markets so investors wouldn't get policed and so that there would be capital markets that could provide large amounts of money to businesses and our economy to grow. And for until very recently, the SEC was the global gold standard for investor protection. Well, that's gone. I mean, the SEC under Trump has now moved from investor protection to management protection. And it is as captured as, unfortunately, the Fed in many respects. So it is cutting back on disclosures. It is cutting back on investor rights. For example, they're even interfering. Investors like to hire what's called, many of them, proxy advisors. It's very difficult if you're an investor to keep track of the proxies at all the public companies.
Right.
And the big investors have to vote on each one of these, whether it's for the director or for some major policy question. And they hire proxy advisors, just like you would hire an advisor for anything else. Well, the SEC is now in the business of interfering with people actually hiring an advisor to give them advice on proxies. It's
How are they
one.
interfering?
Yeah, it's like unbelievable if you didn't know it, right? It's like, how can you say I can't contract with somebody who can give me independent advice? They're interfering with that because that makes investors even more dependent upon management.
Just
And
to
if you
explain to me how that works. How is the SEC blocking that? Just curious because that sounds important.
So it is important, and the details are on our website at Better Markets. So, but at a very high level, what an investor can do, what used to, and there is two big proxy advisor firms that have a large amount of the market for proxy advisors. There are a couple of others, and what you would do is you would hire them to provide you advice, and they would do that. And frankly, most of it was pretty tailored. So, for example, if you were interested in companies that were socially active and cared about, for example, the climate, you could tell your proxy advisor, I would like advice related to that. If you were on the other side and you loved oil and gas and fossil fuels, you could tell them that, and the proxy advisor will tailor it to you. And you then pay them, right? And then they give it to
Right.
you. What the SEC said in one of its proposed rules, I'm not kidding, they proposed a rule where the proxy advisor had to submit any comment about a company to the company's management, and the company's management had the right to comment on it.
Oh,
Well, it's the exact opposite of independent non-management advice. How that's even constitutional is beyond me. The proxy advisory firms have been engaged in litigation, both in Trump 1, I believe in Trump 1 and in Trump 2, about the restrictions that they're trying to put on independent proxy advice. It's just one example. I actually
that's
put a report called "The SEC is Demolishing Investor Protection, Threatening Capital Formation, and the U.S. Economy," which detailed many of the actions that they're taking. But the problem we have is, keep in mind, this is not just an issue for the rich investors. This is an issue that impacts capital formation in the entire economy. Because one of the reasons people all over the world send their money to the United States capital markets is because they are well regulated and well policed.
right.
And they're not going to do that. And in fact, there's been a lot of reporting. I'm sure you've read about it about moving people thinking about putting their money elsewhere. Now, because the U.S. stock market's doing so well, and you look at other You could argue emerging markets are doing well too, but by and large, there's no other place that can compete at the moment as robustly with what's going on in the United States. Leave aside whether it's a bubble or not, or whether or not it's
Yeah.
wise. As an investment vehicle, it's one of the top global places to put your money. But that's because, and this is what they don't get, Paul, that's because they are well regulated and well policed. You take away the well regulated and well policed, then you're going to end up with basically the crooked, rigged markets where you don't know what happens to your money in too many places in the world. And if that happens, that doesn't just hurt the rich people who own most of the financial assets. That's going to have impacts all the way down through the capital formation pipeline, down to the real economy, down to people's jobs.
Okay. Could go on, but actually, a lot of this I did not know. So this is I was completely unaware that the SEC was doing all of that. But just want to move on a bit. But the Better Mark's been writing quite a lot about crypto, that's an interesting. I mean, I've been using this kind of, crypto has suddenly kind of faded from public attention because there's so much else going on because there's AI and so much else. But crypto is still a $2 trillion asset class. And uh, uh, talk to me about crypto and where it fits into all of this.
Well, I should tell you to start with, we have been the tip of the spear fighting crypto since 2020, 2021. We were the leading opponents of FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried back in 21, 22 when he was trying to buy all of Washington and get his, what I call a financial predatory model approved by the CFTC and get special interest legislation through Congress. In fact, we were so much of a thorn in their side, to mix my metaphors,
Yeah.
that Sam called, came into the office for 90 minutes to convince me to support him. Unfortunately, there are so few people that are active at the CFTC, which is where he was trying to get his uh, predatory model adopted. We
This
were
is Sam
pretty much,
Sam Bankman-Fried came in to talk to you.
oh yeah, yeah, him and
Okay.
his bipartisan phalanx of advisors, because he
Yeah.
bought everybody. For about 90 minutes trying to convince us. And I said, Sam, you can, first of all, I have to tell you, Paul, we didn't know about his crimes, obviously. I didn't know
Right.
he was a criminal, but he clearly had his entire business model was a financial predatory model. It basically was, hey, if we get rid of all these kind of customer, investor, and financial stability protections, I can make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, anybody can make a lot of money I mean, like, you could make a lot of money building buildings if you don't put in fire escapes and fire doors. And, if you don't build the foundation right, you can make more money, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. And so that was essentially what Sam Bankman Fried was trying to do in the derivatives markets. And we opposed him. And so not only did he fail to convince us, he also did an end run around. He thought he could bribe us. He offered us $1 million or more. Frankly, I could have asked for 25 million bucks. I'm sure he would have delivered it in a paper bag if I wanted it. We said no. To my knowledge, I don't say this arrogantly. I say it more in sadness than joy. I think we were the only ones in Washington who didn't take his money. And he ended up in the right place, as we now all know. But bad Americans have been out front on this, and we continue to be out front on this because, look, there is no legitimate use case for crypto. They've had 17, 18 years to come up with one. They keep throwing things up like an inflation hedge, countercyclical, you name it, a source of stability, not volatile, blah, blah, blah. Every one of them has turned out to be baseless. The only real use for crypto is tax evasion, money laundering, crime, the worst crime in the world. It's the preferred mechanism of choice for global terrorists, sex traffickers, rogue nations like North Korea and Iran. Why you got to ask yourself why, under those circumstances, could crypto possibly basically be hijack the entire political agenda of Washington? And that's because they followed the Sam Bankman-Fried model of on a bipartisan basis, spending hundreds of millions of dollars in campaigns to buy friends. And this is the astonishing thing,
Okay.
Paul, that people don't know. It's the biggest bait and switch in history. So the hundreds of millions of dollars that they spend in the campaigns, they don't mention crypto. And that's because they know crypto is toxic. The poll after poll shows crypto is toxic with the American people. Both Politico and the Wall Street Journal independently in the run up to the 2024 election, looked at not all of them, looked at the massive amounts of ads bought by the crypto industry supporting candidates in the United States. Not one of them, not one mentioned crypto. And then they get their friends elected who come to Washington, and then they say, crypto voters sent them here. Except the voters sent them there, not one of whom voted based on crypto. None of them were even mostly aware of crypto. They were mostly negative attack ads on extraneous issues having nothing to do with crypto. And so crypto is now basically running Washington. It has hijacked the agenda. The amount of attention that American politicians, the senator from Maryland recently was quoted as saying, I'm spending virtually all my time on crypto. And
Yeah.
I thought, if your constituents knew that, I'm quite sure they wouldn't be happy. And so here we have a financial product of no social use, massive, massive negative uses that is being um, uh, enlarged and integrated with and interconnected with the core of our banking and financial system. Now,
So
I'm sure it's a coincidence, Paul, that the president is getting filthy rich on crypto. Um, but the problem is that, like so many other things, the downside of crypto is not going to fall only on the people playing with crypto and getting rich on crypto. Once they connect it up to the banking and financial system, which they're doing across the board, we are going to. That's why, in many ways, I think what's happening now is worse than what happened before the '08 crash. Before the '08 crash, we had subprime, and that, as you know well, better than almost everybody, how that worked and rippled through the system. Well, we not only have kind of financial um, craziness going on, we have this entire new multi-trillion-dollar financial product that has no value, is incredibly volatile, has rife with conflicts of interest and self-dealing, is going to be a core part of our banking and financial system with, probably within the next 12 to 36 months.
okay, this is, I mean, there it is striking that it's not just, I mean, there's a broader case of question of what happened to the political system, but this is, I mean, campaign finance, massive spending, but also a lot of just uh, personal, basically, effectively bribery, and you've been going after that. I mean, and it is kind of a little shockingly, it's bipartisan. I mean, obviously, nobody has ever been bribed. Uh, the bribery of Donald Trump is, as he would say, like nothing anybody's ever seen before. But there's a lot of, but it does extend to some extent across the political spectrum. You've been writing about that, right?
Well, unfortunately, it has been. And, uh, I think any ordinary person looking at what's happening would think it was bribery. Unfortunately, it's not bribery because the Supreme Court, over the last number of years, has essentially made bribery almost impossible to prove in the political context. And so we have politicians taking massive, massive amounts of money from the crypto industry and then prioritizing their special interests over the American people. And poll after poll, we've got this on our website too. These are not our polls. Poll after poll shows other than the polls that the crypto industry
Right.
purchases. Those polls are pretty favorable to crypto. I'm I'm assuming my view is that that's largely driven by who's paying for the poll. But if you look at the non-industry purchased polls from the Pew, for example, and others, or look at the surveys of the FDIC and the Federal Reserve itself. It shows that the number of people in America who use or own crypto is infinitesimally small. And if you look at the polls that are looking at what voters think, including one, by the way, in the lead up to the 2024 election. In 2024, right before the election, a polling company looked at the swing voters in 6 swing states. 68% of them had a negative view of crypto, right?
Yeah.
That's why crypto doesn't mention crypto in its ads, right? But so what you have, though, is you have all this money coming in to the political system on the Democratic and Republican side, although mostly Republican side. Now that's caused a problem because now Democrats want the money, and their view is, let's state it. Look, elections cost a lot of money. We need to neutralize this money cannon from crypto, and therefore we have to deliver for them so that it either doesn't, they don't fire their money cannon against us, or even better, they give us some of their money. And that's what's going on. And they do that directly through campaigns. They do it through independent expenditures. They do it through super PACs. And they also do it through other aspects of what I call the influence industry, which isn't just campaign money. It's the revolving door where the industry hires former public officials, including congressmen and senators. They purchase them like you go to the store and go to a vending machine, right? They just give them a ton of money, and next thing you know, they're mouthpieces for the crypto industry. And they also, unfortunately, hire lobbyists who are family members and friends of very important people. There was just this story in the paper, it's a little controversial right now, that Senator Gillibrand from New York, her 22-year-old son, has founded a company. And unbelievable, but at 22 years old, that company is being funded by billionaires and a whole bunch of other financial types because apparently he's got a brilliant idea, and they randomly found him in a phone book or something, Paul.
Yeah.
Uh, Everybody's pretending like it has nothing to do with the fact that his mother is not only a powerful senator from New York, and is not only one of the leading cheerleaders and proponent of crypto special interests, but she also happens to be the chair of what's called the DSCC, which is the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee,
Yeah.
which is the vehicle that raises the money to elect Senate Democrats. And so people look at that and they say, and in fact, I put out a press release on this, kind of spelling this out, but you can just read the media reports. I mean, you had to ask yourself, how is it that all these incredibly wealthy billionaires and gazillionaires and millionaires are putting money into this 22-year-old's startup? Now, you'll appreciate this, Paul. The spokesperson for the company said, I kid you not, said, these people are longtime friends of Gillibrand's son. And I said, well, when you're 22 years old, how does long-term friends really work? And where do you run into billionaires? And
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I know if you're a Princeton professor, they're all over the place, but where I come from, running into a billionaire just isn't a common thing, and getting them to give you money if you're 22 years old for a startup company, that may be the American dream, but it ain't working the way it's supposed to be working.
I'm not a Princeton professor anymore, and there are very few billionaires at the City University of New York. Anyway, but okay. There's so much, but we're running long. Let me just ask, just any quick thoughts about AI, which is, AI, I think in some ways is monopolizing attention too much, but still, where's the financial side of that?
I think you're right. It's monopolizing attention too much. And then other ways, I think it's not getting enough attention in the right places and in the right way. As you know, we have been kind of out front on AI. We think that we've got a huge problem here. AI is inevitable. The real issue is what are going to be the safety features. It's like I referred to earlier, right? I mean, look, cars were a great innovation, but they killed a lot of people and too many people until we got airbags, compression bumpers, protective glass, reinforced doors. AI, there's a big fight in the United States now between the people who think AI should proceed unregulated and people who think it should have regulation to some degree. And we think you need a balance. The American people are onto this. They know that it's going to impact. They may not know how, when, or why, but they know based on the data centers, number one, the big data center fight where those gigantic data centers are sucking up electricity, driving up electricity bills, and by the way, straining the electrical grid in the United States to the point where the entire country is going to be subject to blackouts if we're not careful. But look, people's jobs, whether they get a raise, whether they get a retirement, whether they get a loan, at what rate, at what limit, AI is going to drive all of that in the very near future or have a very big impact on it. It's not just your energy bill. It's your local bank, for example. When everything becomes automated for AI, how does a community bank that for years has provided the loans to the local community, whether it's the auto dealer or the local grocery store or the family who sends their kid to college, those community banks are going to come under enormous pressure because they can't keep up with the infrastructure and the spending that they're going to need, investments they're going to need to keep up. And we've got some ideas on how to strengthen community banks because they're so vital to our economy. I mean, as I said earlier, 40% of the lending to small business in the United States come from community banks. You lose community banks, you lose small business, you lose community. So that's just one way, but it's all the way up the chain. It's from the gigantic banks' use of AI. It's, the simplest example is the people drafting the algorithms or writing the algorithms are importing their own bias into the algorithms. Who's
Yeah.
guarding against that? Who, for example, has got, there's this thing, as you know, called the fat finger problem, where, traders make mistakes by hitting the wrong key. And instead of saying buy 100 shares, they just bought 100 million shares. Who's testing pre-deployment AI machines before we find out after the fact? I mean, if you think about this, and I think it was Roe. Roe made this point. I don't know if he did it on your discussion, but he's made it before, as have others.
This is Ro
You know,
Khanna, by the way, Congressman Ro
yeah,
Khanna.
Ro
Yeah.
Khanna, the representative from California, who, truthfully, whether you like him or not, or you agree or don't agree, you should listen to him because he's got lots of thought-provoking ideas that on topical issues people really need to think about, and this is one of them. It's like thinking, well, you know what? Let's open up a nuclear plant in our neighborhood. Well, everybody would say, well, you wouldn't do that. We have to do a million different things to check on that because of the threat. And AI is basically the same, if not worse, because it's less visible, it's less concrete, it's harder to understand. And so, what Better Markets is doing is we put out what we call a people centered agenda that has a variety of pillars that drills down on how we should both think about and have the right balance so that we can get the best of AI with trying to avoid the bad parts of AI, many of which, by the way, are unknown. I'm not saying people are doing anything to do bad things, but we have a technology here that, in many respects, is going to run on autopilot. And, just like we're not letting cars on the road running on autopilot without thoroughly testing them and making sure they're not going to kill everybody, we sure as heck shouldn't be putting out AI on autopilot.
Okay. So much more, but I have to say this stuff altogether makes me, well, I think justifiably much more nervous. I mean, I kind of was,
So can let me end on an up note.
yeah,
And I thought your piece this morning on your almost jury duty service
yeah.
was enlightening. And I have to tell you, I agree. I'm optimistic because the vast majority of the American people are reasonable, community minded, family minded, and people who you can have a discussion with. The problem we have is that there's so much money flooding into the system, and the money represents the extremes. And the extremes are buying the political system and corrupting the political system. We need to figure out how to get more Americans involved so that the reasonable people, the vast majority of Americans, whether they're people that you saw on the jury pool or the people that we talk to in the country all the time, who you can actually have very civil conversations about almost anything about with many, many, hundreds of millions of Americans. I haven't done that personally, but I'm extrapolating. I do think that most Americans agree on most reasonable things to do, striking a balance within a reasonable range. And our problem now is that we have a Supreme Court that's empowering billionaires and money, and we have a president that doesn't care about laws, norms, customs, or rules. And what we do need, and what we're trying to do at Better Markets, we just did this with the SEC campaign we did, is try and engage people. We went out and tried to engage retail investors. And the result was, Paul, to our shock, we've got 200,000 or more retail investors just commented on a SEC rule. That is a historic high of comments for any rulemaking in SEC history that we're aware of. So there are people out there, and we need to figure out where they are, how to identify them, how to engage them, and get them engaged. And if we do, then I do believe that the core of the American dream, which lives in Main Street America, can get reflected in our political systems.
I think that's an upbeat note on which to end. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate it.